Welcome, fellow audio sorcerers, wizards, and gurus to my channel. I am Dan Spencer, and I am the Audio Sorcerer. This is the channel where I teach you how to perfect your audio recording, mixing, and mastering skills. And in today's video, we're going to talk about one of my favorite plugins, which is the Slate VMR. So we're actually going to go over every single module in this tutorial, and I'm going to teach you how I use each of them, what instruments I use them on, and I'm also going to show you which ones I don't really use, and it's far and few. I pretty much use them all. I love this plugin. So before we get to tutorial, I do want to remind you guys that I actually do mixing and mastering. So you guys can go to audiosorcerer.com, and if you don't remember that, the link is below, and you can check out my rates, and you can also check out my samples. So before we get to the video, make sure you give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to know when I have new videos coming out. So without further ado, let's get to this awesome tutorial. Alright, so here we are in Pro Tools, and the song that I'm going to be using for this tutorial is a song I wrote called Get Through This. I wrote this in response to the COVID-19 situation that we're all going through. It's been somewhat of an outlet for me. Now, I haven't recorded the lyrics for it yet, so there's no vocals in this session, but I think the instruments will do a good representation of showing how these different modules work. So I'm going to talk about how I use these modules and then also how kind of Slate suggests that you use them, like on specific instruments and such. We'll go into detail as we get into the tutorial with that. But first, I think we need to actually give you an overview of the plugin before we get to that. So let me open up the Slate VMR. So this is what the Slate VMR looks like when it first launches. Now it loads 6 different modules initially. You can't see the 6th one here unless I click down here on the trimmer. And then if I go back here, you can see the first 5 again. It only shows 5 at a time, but the 6th one is active. So whatever you drop in your slots is active, just so you know that. Now this is just a suggested plugin chain, and you don't have to use it. And back in the day, it actually loaded as a blank slate, which I prefer. So let's actually clear this out. So if you go up to the trash can up here and click on this, it clears this all out here. Now, you have quite a few slots to work with. I'm not sure the total, but it goes pretty far down the alphabet, so you don't have to worry about running out of space for your modules. And over here on your left-hand column, you have all the different modules that are available in this plugin. And there are so many, and that's what makes this plugin so great. You have endless possibilities to work with. Now, these modules are also broken down into folders based upon their type. So I can click on the dynamics, and this is going to have all the compressors in here. EQ, there's some different EQs in here, and so forth. This is harmonics, there's some stuff for mastering in here. If you have a virtual mic system, your mics are going to show up in here, which I actually do have the virtual mic system here. And this is your preamps here. And if you want to go back and see all your plugins at one time, you got to make sure none of these are selected, and now they all came back. So there they are. Now across the top, we have presets up here if you click there. And I do want to mention while I'm in here, I do have one favorite preset in here that I think is awesome that comes with this plugin by default. If you go down to drums and you go down to drum bus tight and punchy, this sounds amazing on a drum bus for anything, for rock music, pop music, whatever. It sounds great. So keep that preset in mind for when you're mixing. So outside of the preset section, we have an A-B section, which allows you to set up 2 different plugin chains. So you can A-B back and forth, which one sounds better. I honestly don't do a whole lot of A-Bing in plugins, but it exists if you need it. You guys already know what the trash can does. Now, this is a rotary knob setting here, and this should actually be disabled if you don't have touchscreen or Slate Raven. I do have a Slate Raven, as you can see by my overlay down here. And what this does is if you have it enabled, it basically means you're going to use your mouse or your finger to make a circle, like a rotary knob circle, to go, from left to right. So let me actually grab a module over here that has a rotary knob. So let's grab the AirEQ. Let's pop that in here. So I have the rotary setting on now, which means I need to make a circle with my mouse for this to work properly. So if I make a circle like that, it works fine. Now, if I disable it, I need to go from basically horizontal. So if I do that, and like that, just straight left to right. That's probably what you want if you don't have a control interface for this, or touchscreen interface, I should say. So I do have the Slate Raven, so I'm going to leave this enabled. And let's move on to the gear icon here, which is your settings menu. So in here, you have online support user guide. The user guide is great. I'm even referencing that now because there's so much in here that I need to sometimes reference it myself, especially if it's a tutorial. I want to give you, accurate information. So I'd like to peek at that here and there. And oversampling is something that is important because oversampling is something that can improve your audio quality, and it has to do with distortion artifacts. So what I recommend for oversampling is that you leave it off when you're mixing, and when you're ready to bounce down your track, put it on. Now, I do actually want to go over oversampling in detail because I think this is important. So I actually have a website here that has a really good way of describing it. And this is actually off the FabFilter website. So this is oversampling here. The limited algorithm often needs to make very quick changes to the audio in order to remove peaks while preserving transparency and apparent volume. These sudden changes can introduce aliasing, which causes distortion and generally reduces the quality of the audio signal. Oversampling is a way to reduce the aliasing by running the internal limiting process at a higher sample rate that is a multiple of the host sampling rate. So this could be very important to get better quality in your music. Now, I'll be honest, it's sometimes hard to know a difference, and someone who's not seasoned and your average listener is not going to know a huge difference in this. But, you should definitely enable this if you have the opportunity, and also if your computer can handle it. That's the key there. This is very CPU intensive to do a lot of oversampling. So let's go to the next paragraph here. When do I need to turn on oversampling? You need it more when the limiting process operates faster using short look-ahead times and when limiting more heavily, both leading to a higher level of aliasing. Aliasing has the effect of adding spurious non-musical frequencies to the audible signal, which degrades the audio quality. In addition, aliasing causes higher intersample peaks and then can cause distortion later on, for example, during D to A conversion or conversion to MP3. There are only two small drawbacks to oversampling. It increases CPU usage, and it can introduce a very slight pre-ring due to the phase linear filtering that is needed. Generally, this effect is so small that it's inaudible, but it's good to be aware of this and not blindly assume that oversampling is always better. And this down here tells you what oversampling to choose, what they suggest, but a lot of plugins don't have an option like this here to go, up this many samples. So that's what oversampling is. And again, they tell you down here that don't blindly choose oversampling. I like to do it, and I actually use another DAW too called Cakewalk by BandLabs, and they have a automatic oversampling that you can set when you're bouncing, so you don't have to enable it on every plugin. All right, so let's get back to Pro Tools over here. Okay. All right, so back in Pro Tools here, a couple other things. Your slots down here, they're only at 3 now since we cleared it out, but if you add like a 4th plugin, this is going to expand and so forth. Also up here, you have your different strips that come part of the Slate bundle here. And these are kind of presets based upon, I guess you can say, the style. So this is a classic strip. This is a classic strip number 2. As you can see, switch out a module in there. You got the vibe strip. You got the deep strip, the extreme strip, the Mixbuss strip, and the EQ strip. So you got about 7 different chain of modules there that you can initially start with and start tweaking to your liking. So with that being said, let's start talking about each module individually. So the first module we're going to talk about is the AirEQ. And we're just going to go from top to bottom here when it comes to modules throughout this tutorial. So I think it'll be easier for you guys to follow along. If you hover over this or right click on it, it's going to launch a little description about what this plugin does. So it says Air is a new type of filter that helps you to restore or to add brightness to the sound while always remaining natural. Now, there are 2 different things that I would use this plugin for. I would use it on vocals to get some of that high-end shimmer in them. And I also use it on the master bus to bring a little bit air into the overall mixer master. And for this tutorial, since we don't have any vocals in the session, we're actually going to use it on the master bus, which I already have over here, and that's where this plugin's at. So let's take a listen to the song here, and I will dial this in here, and then you can see what it does. Okay, so I kind of like it right there. That was less than a 3 dB boost, 2.83 dBs. Now, what you probably heard that most on was the ride cymbal and the snare drum. The snare drum changed a little bit there. You get a little more of that high snap out of it. And then the ride cymbal just had a little bit more shimmer to it. Now, for this plugin here, I'm trying to make this tutorial so tell you guys what you need to use and what you don't need to use. Everything else on this plugin, ignore. This stuff here is not really relevant to how you can be using this plugin here. It's nice that they added it in here, but honestly, I don't think you're going to be using it for this particular plugin. So that being said, let's move on to the next plugin, which is the AirEQ Earth. All right, so talking about the AirEQ Earth, let's right-click over here. And it's described as Earth brings deep and solid sublows. It can be described as an adjustable transformer. Now, I only use this plugin on my master bus. And if you guys haven't seen my low-end focus trick video yet, check it out. I do what I'm about to do with the Slate Infinity EQ, but Slate himself has a tutorial doing it using this plugin. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So let's take a listen to the song, and I'll show you what I'm going to do. All right, so the first thing I did in this plugin was I enabled the low cut. And knowing the fundamental frequency of this song is actually 20 some hertz, I think 22, I went to the first resonant frequency, which is 44 hertz, and that's where I set this frequency knob to. And then I went down to the Q here, and then I moved it a little bit to the right, which makes a little bit of a sharper Q here. Now what this does is it's cutting everything below 44 hertz gradually while boosting at 44 hertz. And that's what's giving us that nice little extra low end in here. And if you were listening well, you probably heard it on the kick drum. And that's actually my low end focus trick that you guys can check out in another video. So that being said, let's move on to our third plugin, which is the CSEQ. So the Custom Series Equalizer is a pretty cool EQ. Stephen Slate combined a bunch of different EQs and characteristics to create this EQ. He did different EQs and characteristics per band that he felt that was the best for that specific band, like your high frequencies, high mids, and low frequencies. And it's more of a broad EQ. It doesn't make overly dramatic changes like the SSL or the Neve EQs we're going to look at later. It's real smooth and real natural, and that's probably why it's my favorite EQ within the VMR. So as we did for the other modules here, let's right-click on this and read the description. The Custom Series Equalizer combines aspects of some of the most famous analog equalizers in the history of audio. Each of its bands in both boost and cut mode are customized using classic analog curves and unique harmonic profiles. It is extremely musical and intuitive to use on both individual tracks and full mixes. So, I mean, that's kind of what we went over before. It's just, it's a very broad EQ. So I just popped it on this chorus arpeggio in here because I think this would be a good sound to try this out on here. I mean, honestly, this EQ is good on every instrument. There's not a single instrument that this is not great for. So with that being said, let's test it out on the ARP. All right, so I made some minor adjustments to this track, and then I also made some that I didn't keep, as you saw. And the reason I was doing that is that I wanted to boost some of these up to plus 10, and for you guys to actually see it's not that dramatic of a change when you get to plus 10. That's what I'm trying to say about this EQ. It's very broad and very smooth. You're not going to go over the top with it. And so what I did for this arpeggio was I just did a little bit of boost up here. I mean, not even 2 dBs at 10K to get a little bit of air in it. And I felt like it was a little sharp sounding. It was a little ear piercing. And this is the chorus of the song, so there's going to be vocals here. So I need this to be behind the vocals somewhat. So I cut a little bit of 4K out. Not very much, just, you know, a little bit past 1 dB. And then I noticed that a little bit around 100, I was able to pull a little bit of low end out. There's not a huge amount of low end in this arpeggio, but I thought it gave a little bit. It helps to kind of move with a little bit of that extra 100 there. I just did a high pass down here about 60 hertz just to clear out some of that really low end. But yeah, I mean, this EQ is really cool. It's very subtle, and you can make very minimal adjustments to it, and you can go even really high or low with the gain, and it won't change the sound that much. So it's almost like a safe EQ to some standpoint for even professionals and beginners. It's a great EQ to use. So that being said, let's move on to the next plugin, which is the CS Lift. So this is what the Custom Series Lift module looks like. It has a high lift and a low lift, and then 2 parameters each. You have presence and silky for high, you have big and punchy for low, and then obviously a gain knob. So let's right click over here and read the description. The Custom Series Lift contains 4 unique curves that boost the entire upper and lower frequency ranges. Like its brother, the Custom Series Equalizer, It borrows characteristics from the most famous analog EQs and has custom harmonic profiles for each curve. Alright, so I decided to put this on the snare drum track because we're going to want to get a little bit of low out of it, and we're going to want to get a little bit of air out of it. So this plugin is basically meant to be used on stuff you need to get some more air out of, or stuff you need to get some more low end out of. So you can use it on specific instruments, or it's also good on a mix bus. So with that being said, let's listen to the snare track here and see what I'll do with it. Alright, so I really like what that did to the snare drum here. So I ended up going with the present parameter here, and I just did a pretty minimal boost on the high end here, so it's not even 2 dBs. Now for the low end here, I went quite a bit up here. We almost went up 8 dBs on the punchy setting here, because I feel like the snare needed that, those low mids, like somewhere between the 100 to like 250 range to give it that really oomph that it needed, and this plugin did fantastic for it. So as you can see, this is a great plugin to get that low and high stuff you need out of your snare, because the snare is one of those particular tracks that need to have a little bit of both to really make it stand out in a mix. So let's move on to the next plugin here, which we're going to skip over the classic tubes, because that's only if you have a VMS system, which not everybody has, so we're not going to do that in this tutorial. So the next plugin will be the FG-116. Alright, so the FG-116, this compressor is modeled after the infamous 1176 blackface compressor. So let's right-click on this and see what the description is. So it says the FG-116 is an authentic recreation of the classic American FET compressor. This classic compressor is amazing on everything, and is certainly a favorite on lead vocals and drums. Now that is true, but out of all the stuff in here, I would strictly use this compressor for bass. I think it is amazing on bass guitar, and that's what we're going to use it for here. So I've been working on this tutorial for a couple of days, and I didn't have bass when we first started this tutorial, so I added one in. I just added a simple kind of like synth bass with a nice little sub to it here, so let me play that for you. So as you can see, that was nothing fancy, but I think it sits pretty well in the mix for this. Now you did hear it with the compressor on, but I didn't have any reduction happening. And what I recommend doing for this compressor to get you started is actually go into the bass preset here. and setting that. And what I like about it is it does a medium attack and medium release. We don't really want a fast or slow attack on the bass, and that goes for release because we kind of want this compressor to kind of hold the bass for sustain, especially for a song like this. Now, if you're doing something like pop punk where you got someone using a pick on their bass guitar, then that's another story. But I think this is a good setting for what we're going to do. So why don't we play the song and we'll dial it in here. All right, so as you saw, I made no adjustments. I actually really like the default for that. I did actually turn down the bass a bit because this compressor did bring up the volume just a smidge. And if you were watching the gain reduction here, it was pretty much staying around -3 with a minor maybe reduction -2, going back and forth between -2 and -3. So it was staying very steady. And any of you guys listen to the song, you can realize the bass kind of sustains in it, and that's what we want. We want to kind of just hold it steady. So this compressor setting is perfect for the song. No complaints. A couple other settings down here, like noise reduction. This is a synth bass. This is being played with my keyboard, so there's no outside noise in it. So I probably don't need this on, so we'll turn that off. And the mix knob, I'm using it 100% right now because we're only doing -3 dB gain reduction. So I don't really need to mix it in. That's not a whole lot of reduction, so I think we'll just leave that on 100%. So the way that these Slate compressors all work is you have to turn up the input knob to actually get more gain reduction. There is no actual threshold knob on here, as you can see. And, as you go up with this, it's going to get louder, so then you'd have to back up the output. So it's somewhat of a balancing act, I guess you could say, but it's still really easy to use. You only got a few knobs here. So yeah, that's basically FG-116. Again, I think out of all the stuff in here, as you're going to see, I think just use this on bass and you'll be fine. Again, it sounds great on vocals too, but there's another compressor coming up that's going to be even better for that. So that being said, let's actually move on to the FG-116 Modern. So this is the FG-116 Modern, and it's probably the nicest looking module in this plugin. This blue really, pops out. So I do like it for looks. However, it's probably the module I use the least. And the reason for that is because there's other modules in here that I think are better for the stuff I use them for. So let's actually right click on this and read the description. FG-116 Modern, hot rodded Rev A FET compressor. So that's very unhelpful. This is actually a custom version of the blue version of the 1176 compressor. So this is something that Slate kind of customized to his liking or for something specific he wanted it for. I think it's more just kind of taking the, 1176 blue and putting it in overdrive. And that's how they describe it, as hot rodded. So the only thing really different on this compressor than the FG-116 is that it has a high pass button. What that does is it basically, when it's enabled, it kind of ignores the low frequencies. And what I mean by that is that when there's like a buildup of low frequencies, it's not kicking the compressor in. It's not making gain reduction happen. It's looking for frequencies above wherever its cross point is. I'm not really sure where the cross point is for it, but it's probably in the low mid range. The other thing you need to look at is the two circuits here. Now, circuit 1 is what you would use if you want to bring something forward in the mix. That would be what you want to use for lead vocals if you decide to use it on that. Now, circuit 2 is described in the manual as a more breathable and punchy low end and overall smoother response on the top end. Now, we're actually going to use that circuit for this tutorial here. And what we're actually going to use this compressor on is actually our Mixbuss. This compressor can be used on a mix bus, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, I do not recommend using this on a mix bus if you have the Slate bundle, because the bundle comes with a whole series of mix bus compressors that are absolutely amazing. So we're actually going to start with a preset, and we're going to do the full mix exciter 1. So now I'm going to hit play, and we'll try to dial this in. All right, I like that. So as you saw, I had to go in and I had to turn up the input a little bit to get some gain reduction. Now on a mix bus, you're looking for probably anywhere from -2 to -3 dBs of reduction. Again, it depends on the genre and it depends on the song. And one thing that is part of this preset is that this mix knob is at about 25% or 20% here. And that's because we want to kind of blend this in here. We don't want to do, we don't want to over compress the mix. So this actually kind of helps here. So with, -3 dB reduction and the mix knob at 20, not a whole lot of stuff is happening. But if you were listening closely, you will see that the snare was a little more controlled and just a very smidge more punchy. And that's what I was going for. And you can also hear that on the pluck of the bass too. And that's really what we want from a mix bus compressor. We want to add some, punch to the mix. And even a song like this that's kind of slow, it's got a pretty nice drum beat and, it's got a plucky bass. So we definitely want to have some punch in it. So that's how I would use the FG-116. You're not going to see me really using it in any of my sessions, but for this tutorial, that's where I would place it in our available options. So let's move on to the next compressor, which is the FG-116 Vintage. All right, so we got the FG-116 Vintage here. And I'll be honest, this is my favorite compressor in all of the Slate bundle here. This basically represents the blue version of the 1176 without any modifications to it. It's supposed to be an exact model of it. So let's read the description on it over here. FG-116 Vintage, emulation of vintage Rev A FET compressor. So exactly what I just said. So this sounds great on vocals. I would only use this compressor on vocals or leads that you want to bring up front. That could be like a guitar solo, it could be like a lead synth. And unfortunately, I don't have any vocals in this session. So what we're going to do is we're going to use it on the chorus arpeggio that you've been listening to. And we're going to kind of pretend like it's our lead. I know we talked about earlier in the tutorial, it's going to sit behind the vocals, but there's no reason we can't, bring it up a bit and bring it out and maybe even just flatten it out a bit. So let's listen to it and I will dial in this compressor. Okay, you gotta admit, this compressor sounds sexy. Not only did it bring the synth forward a bit, it also kind of smoothed it out. It even sounded a little less harsh than it did initially. I really love the way this sounds on this synth. I'm probably going to leave this one in the final mix, to be honest. So you saw I had to make some, input adjustments here to get some gain reduction. And then I also needed to bring down the attack time a bit because I wanted to make sure that some of the transient was coming through. Now, the key to making this compressor bring the sound forward also is to have the release all the way to the right, and that's what helps us get it a bit forward. So, I hope you guys like this compressor as much as I do. So, with that being said, let's move on to our next module, which is the FG-401. All right, so we got the FG-401 here, and this is my second favorite compressor that exists inside of the Slate bundle. Now, to my knowledge, it is somewhat of a knockoff of the SSL channel strip compressor. I think it's somewhat of a hybrid. I don't think it's an exact replica of it, but it does sound really good. So let's actually right-click over here and read the description. This compressor is a hybrid of some of the most popular VCA channel compressors that are used in modern audio. It sounds great on everything and is an extremely versatile with a transformer option, as well as two distinct circuit paths that ooze analog goodness. So it sounds pretty good when you hear it that way. So I recommend this compressor on any drums you're trying to get punch out of, but more than anything, the drum bus. This thing inflates the drum bus. It's fantastic. So what we're going to do, I actually already created a drum bus in here and I have all the drums going to it. We're actually going to go to a preset in here, and it's actually the preset I mentioned earlier that was part of a larger preset, and that is the drum bus tight and punchy. So why don't we take a listen to the mix and see what that did, and I'll probably have to dial in some settings, but let's go from there. All right, so you probably heard a lot of punch that was added to my drums, and you probably heard it on the kick drum more than anything. Also, there was this inflation that kind of came around from the sides of the drums there that kind of just made them sound that much bigger. And that's kind of what this compressor does. It kind of just inflates the sound, and it makes it more punchy on top of that. So that's really why I love this compressor. And for me, again, I mostly just use it on a drum bus, but you can use it on a kick track individually or a snare track individually. It'll sound great on that too. So so let's move on to our next module, which is the FG-73. All right, so we got the FG-73 British and preamp here, and I think you guys can guess what this is modeled after. Of course, it's a Neve. So why don't we read the description on it over here. The FG-73 preamp emulation emulates one of the most famous preamps in the audio industry. It has a rich, warm, and present tone. It can also be driven to saturation to add analog distortion effects to vocals, drums, bass, and more. So this can be used on tracks that you recorded like with a microphone, or even if you plug your guitar directly into your audio interface to record it. But the idea is that the instruments that you record outside of the computer, what I mean by that is instruments that aren't like virtual synths that you're playing with your keyboard and such, that they're recorded with a flat audio interface, like untainted sound. So if you're, going in directly line in with like a guitar with, quarter-inch cable into your audio interface, that's going to be a pretty untainted sound. It's when you start using the mic preamps inside of your audio interface that the sound gets tainted a bit, and then this becomes less realistic, less of an emulation. However, it still sounds really good if you just pop it on every track, to be honest. So I popped it on our arpeggio track here so we can kind of hear it. It's going to be pretty subtle, so we're going to mostly listen to this in solo. I don't think we're going to listen to the mix. So let me solo up the arpeggio here. And let's play this and take a listen. And there's not a whole lot to dial in and out. It's just some virtual console drive and then your volume. And also you got your phase inversion here if you need to enable that for whatever reason. So yeah, let's listen. So to the trained ear, you probably heard even still just a minor difference. It just adds a little bit of coloration to the sound. Now, bringing up the virtual drive is where we start to hear it a little bit more. You can obviously overdrive this quite a bit and get kind of that British muffled drive sound on there, which, could be good for vocal effects. It also could be good for a parallel compression with a vocal where you kind of overdrive it and kind of just bury it behind the lead vocal. So it's also good for that. I'll probably do another tutorial on how to do that technique. I don't want to do it right now because we don't have any vocals in this session. But again, you can add this onto every track if you want, just for some coloration. I don't necessarily think that's something you have to do because there's some other plugins in here that we haven't got to yet that are going to add that analog sound that is going to get you where you want to be. So that's the FG-73. So next we're going to move on to the FG-76, and we're just going to do a comparison using the same track because they basically do the same thing. They're both preamps that are going to add some coloration. So let's move on to that. So we got the FG-76 Vintage Pre here. I'm actually not sure what this is emulated after. I know it's obviously some classic vintage 2 preamp, but I'm not sure what specifically it's modeled after. So let's right click here and read about it. The FG-76 preamp recreates the tone of one of the most legendary preamps in the audio industry, known for its fat, thick vintage tone. It can also be driven to saturation for a perfect tube distortion effect. So this is going to be used the exact same way as the FG-73, so I'm not going to go into that. So why don't we actually just take a listen to it, and I'll do a comparison between the 76 and 73 after I get this one dialed in where I like it. So here we go. Okay, between the two of these, I actually like the FG-76 better. Now, as the arpeggio is moving, you got those bass notes in there, and this really emphasizes them a bit. It brings out that low end while keeping the punch, although the punch has nothing to do with this specific module, but it brings out what we have, and I like that. Now, the FG-73 is a little more harsh, but not in a bad way, in a good way. That saturation is... it's kind of described that it's more of a warm sound, but as I'm listening to it, I feel like it's more getting saturated in the upper mids a little bit, which is great for vocals. But I feel for this particular synth, I think the FG-76 sounds the best on that. With that being said, we're going to remove this module here, and we will leave this on. I do want to mention at the end of this, we're going to do a listen to this mix with all the Slate plugins off and then all of them on. I'm hoping to have almost every Slate plugin in this VMR active so you can kind of hear it as a whole. So that's what I'm shooting for. So with that being said, let's move on to our next plugin, which is the FGA. All right, so got the FGA here, and this is actually modeled after the API EQ, which is an American EQ. And I think it's modeled after the one that's actually in their consoles, I believe. So what I really love about this EQ is it is extremely transparent and extremely clean. If I just need to bring out some frequencies in a particular track, this is the EQ I'll go to for that, where I don't want to add a major amount of coloration. So let's actually read a description on this. It says the FGA reproduces the sound and characteristics of one of the most famous American equalizers that is known for its musical tone and saturation. So I think we should definitely go over some of the parameters in this EQ. We're not going to talk about the frequency settings and the gain settings because that's on all EQs, but I do want to mention the OPAMP, I guess that's how you pronounce it. That basically activates nonlinear slight saturation harmonics to the overall signal. This feature is on by default, and that came straight out of the manual I just read. Leave it on. Don't even bother turning it off. That'll just save us time. So let's move on to the filter here. Now, the filter is going to enable a high-pass and low-pass filter. In this EQ, you can't change what those are. So they are by default 50 hertz for the high-pass filter and 15 kilohertz for the low-pass filter. Your high filter and your low filter basically turn your low frequency band down here and your high frequency band into a shelf or a bell, depending on how you have it set. If you enable it, it becomes a shelf. And that's really all there is to this EQ. Now, I do want to mention, if you move this, you'll see that it goes in between these numbers here. If I hold control on my computer and start moving, I can go in between the numbers that are set in here, which is kind of nice. So what I put this on here because I really liked using this EQ for bringing out high frequencies, like really high frequencies, like stuff in the air range, like, above 8K, 10K. So I'm actually going to put this on our ride cymbal that exists in the chorus. I'm actually just going to go to a preset for it here. I'm going to go over to overheads. So let's actually hear what this sounds like and see if I need to even dial anything in. All right, so that sounded really great on the ride cymbal, and that's with pretty minimal adjustments in here. I think the biggest gain change was -4 here at this 400 band. But, for the most part, didn't have to do a whole lot. I will say the ride cymbal sounded pretty good right off the bat, so we didn't have to make too many adjustments. But as you heard when I was playing this, I did make some adjustments up here in the top band just for you to kind of see what can happen. So I brought this up to 20 kilohertz, which is pretty cool. This EQ goes all the way up there. And I brought it up to plus 12 all the way up. And it actually didn't sound pretty bad there because, you're getting that high in frequency range. We're starting to get outside of the range that we can hear. So what's happened is it's picking up some of the frequencies below that too and boosting them. So it's really getting some air into your sound. So I think that sounds fantastic. I would mostly use this EQ on, as mentioned before, stuff that you want to make adjustments to more surgically, in the sense of you don't want to add a whole lot of coloration. It's like, hey, I got a frequency in here. It either needs to be cut or boosted. This is the EQ to do that. So with that being said, let's move on to our next module, which is the FG-Bomber. All right, so we got the FG-Bomber here, and I'm actually using this on my Mixbuss, and I do actually use this plugin on my Mixbuss in probably 99% of the sessions that I mix. It is fantastic on a Mixbuss. It can also be used as a distortion plugin or for parallel compression. As mentioned in another plugin earlier, you could kind of distort a duplicate of a track and then distort it quite a bit with this plugin and then bury that in with the original, and you get a nice kind of distorted parallel compression. But in this scenario, we're just going to strictly talk about it from a Mixbuss standpoint. So let's right click over here and read about it. The Bomber uses a sophisticated analog modeled circuit path to increase the impact of tracks and mixes. It adds punch, depth, and explosive dynamic 3D enhancement. So when we hear the word 3D enhancement, to my mind, I automatically think master bus, because, we want to do everything to get our mixes wide, big, coming out of the speakers. So, and that's kind of what this plugin's for. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start with a preset, and then we'll see what kind of changes I need to make. We're going to do Mixbuss Wow, and let's take a listen to what it does. Now, I think we could say simply that this plugin sounds absolutely amazing. Just putting this preset, Mixbuss Wow on here just made the song pop out of the speakers, even pop out of the headphones that I'm wearing right now. It sounds amazing. And I did go between fat and tight to kind of hear the differences there. And I didn't really care for tight. I didn't get much from it. Fat obviously added some of that low end in, but the song has a pretty solid low end now, especially the fact that we kind of been massaging it as we've been adding these plugins. So I didn't feel like that was the right setting for this. So present is definitely the best for this song. Your drive is like kind of adding in like your console drive, I guess you can say. And this is pretty minimal. It's only on less than 3 dBs right now boost. And intensity is your mix knob, how much you're adding this in. So we only have this at 20%, and that means that we're kind of blending it in. It's almost like a parallel effect. And that's all we really need to make it sound that good. I love it. I hope you guys heard it because it's drastically different. So that being said, let's move on to our next module, which is the FGN. All right, so we got the FGN here. And of course, this EQ is modeled after the Neve EQ. So let's read a little bit about it over here. All right, this gorgeous sounding equalizer is modeled after one of the most classic British designs in the history of production. This equalizer is lush, fat, and bold. It sounds great on everything from drums to vocals. It can even add that perfect saturation to synth and electronic tracks. All right, so this EQ is very colorful and it has a lot of character, and that's what makes it great. I think this probably is the best EQ to use on lead vocals out of all the modules in here, because it gives you a lot of that analog character to it, and that's kind of what we want on lead vocals. You need a lot of character to them. So you can also use it on drums. It does sound great on those, and I like to use it on other things like pads per se, and that's actually what we're going to use it on here. So let me solo up this pad for you so you can actually hear what it sounds like first, and then we will start messing with the EQ. Okay, so I like it there. Again, you're not going to hear anything overly dramatic on this pad here, as opposed to, hearing it on a lead vocal track. But what I did was I brought a little bit of air into the pad here. And I also brought a little bit out at, about 2.5. I thought that was more of the focus of this pad here. And I wanted just a little bit more of that in there to bring it out from the background. And then I also felt that a lot of the low end that I wanted from this pad wasn't going to be super low. So I'm using about, 150 there, and I did a little bit of boost there. I felt like I heard all of the low, the bottom part of the chord when that was boosted, when I had it way up. So I brought it back a bit because, we actually have bass guitar in here, so we don't want to overdo with this. And I did a high pass filter up to 80 here. Now, the reason I did boost some lows here is because this pad in the verses is pretty much the bass. The bass guitar doesn't actually exist in the verses, so we do need this to have some low end to it. And you can also automate, the low end for this to use less at the chorus and use more at the verse if you need to when you're mixing. So that's always a possibility. So yeah, so that's the FGN here. And there's really nothing else to it. You got all your bands here, and you got your high pass filter. And then you can enable drive if you want. If you want a little extra saturation in there, that's an option too. So with that being said, let's move on to our next module, which is the FGS. All right, so we got the FGS here, and this is one of my favorite EQs inside of this bundle here. It's modeled after the SSL console EQ, so let's read a little bit about it here. This classic equalizer is modeled off of the famous mixing desk EQ, and it is the ultimate workhorse. This EQ adds little bits of harmonics that help shape the mid bands and gives them an aggressive sound on drums, bass, and guitars when boosted heavily. So this EQ sounds absolutely amazing on overdriven guitars. I will use it on all my overdrive guitars when I'm doing a rock or pop rock song. Sounds great on drums. Sounds great on vocals. It really sounds great on everything. I use this on my kick drums all the time, and it is great on all genres. But it is absolutely fantastic on the rock genre when you're trying to get a nice beater sounding kick. So. With that being said, we're going to use this on the kick drum in my track here, and let's play it here and start messing with it. All right, so I think that sounds pretty good. Sorry it took so long to dial in there. This kick has a really nice low end to it, but it's missing a little bit of that beater sound that we need for it to stick out on like laptop speakers. So we got a little bit of it here with this EQ. Now we're going to do a little bit more processing on this kick with some other modules as we go along, but I think this is a good start for it. So that being said, let's move on to the next module, the FG Stress. All right, so we got the FG Stress here, and this is, of course, is modeled after the Distressor compressor. This is, I remember working with these in college back in the day, and I used to love these. They get you a really crunchy compression sound, depending on how you use them. However, my experience with them has always been using them on the snare drum, and that's what we're going to do here. Let's read the description on it here. The FG Stress is a reproduction of the Empirical Labs EL8 distressor. Okay, so not a whole lot of information there, but if you've ever seen one of these before, it's a pretty good replica of it. I've gotten some pretty close sound to the original with it. So again, we're going to use this on the snare drum here. And why don't we start with the preset on it? I like to start with presets on compressors and then dial them because it's a little bit easier. Obviously, there's a lot more knobs to work with than an EQ. And sometimes you don't always know what you're looking for when you start with a compressor. So why don't we go down to Snare Punchy 1. Let's start with that, and let's play the song here. All right, so that sounded pretty amazing, just with the initial preset on. Now I dialed back the output volume a little bit just so it kind of matched up here. And what I noticed about this compressor was it added just a little bit of punch, and that's what we wanted. You saw the gain reduction was just maybe hitting -2, and the release is very fast because it popped right off as soon as it came in. And then also it kind of just really brought out that low end of the snare, that low mids that was giving it that really beefy sound. And that's what I love about it. And it's also made it very controlled too. It didn't make it compact where it was small, but it kept it big and just very controlled. So just going over a few of the settings in here, you have your input level, you have your attack, release, and then your output. Again, this compressor works like the other ones where you got to turn up the input for the gain reduction to start kicking in. You have your ratio here. We're using a 2:1. That's a pretty low ratio. So it's kind of amazing that the snare is getting that much of a coloration from that. And I think it's actually more from the circuitry of this module than that. So down here, we have the detector section. And I would just want to read a little bit about this for you from the manual so you know what these do. So the detector high pass basically adds a 86 Hz high pass, 6 octave, to stop low frequency modulation. The bell here does a push at 6 kHz to increase the compression sensitivity in the mids. And the link basically just combines the left and right inputs before feeding a single mono signal to the detector. Therefore, the same gain reduction is applied on both the left and right channels. Please note that this mode is effective with stereo tracks only. So yeah, if you don't have a stereo track, don't even worry about this button here. So for the audio section here, the high pass, it adds a 80 Hz high pass, 18 dB octave to smoothly attenuate the lows. The distortion 2 adds a second harmonic in the compressed signal. And distortion 3 adds a third harmonic in the compressed signal. So we're adding a third harmonic to the snare here, and I think that's partially what we're hearing that extra crunchy sound from that I love from this compressor. It almost gives this really crunchy sound when you add it to the snare drum properly. So as you can tell, I really love this compressor, and it also has a mix knob, so you can blend it in, do some parallel compression. So I would say the only other instrument I would use this on is the bass. It sounds great on bass, but this is going to be your go-to for a snare drum. So let's move on to our next module, which is the Gate Classic. All right, so we got the Gate Classic here. Now, I'm not a huge fan of gates. I hardly ever use them. There are 2 different ones inside of this Slate bundle. They are pretty new. Now this classy gate here is described as traditional straightforward gate, highly efficient in removing background noise from guitars, vocals, and other acoustically recorded source material. So basically you would want to use this gate on anything but drums, because as you can see over here, we have one specially for drums. Now, what I use this on, since I don't have vocals in here, I would recommend that this is probably best for vocals, because if you're lazy, you could just pop this on here and it'll clean out any of the background noise you have in between vocal lines, or in between verse and chorus, whatever kind of breaks you have. So in this scenario, I'm actually going to use this on this big hit drum we have. Now, I know I said that you would want to use the other one on drums, but this one is just basically a single hit for the most part. It's this big kind of tubby drum in the chorus that helps kind of accent some of the downbeats. So let's play it here without the gate on, so you can hear what this sounds like. Okay, so that's all this sound really does. It just kind of accents the downbeats of the phrases. And what you can actually do with this is, per se, you didn't like that the space that it's in, like the reverb that's built into the sound. We can actually shorten it up a bit. And so I've already gone in and I've set some of the settings on this gate here. And let me let you hear what that sounds like. So listening there, it actually doesn't sound very good, and that's kind of the point here. We're trying to remove some of that excess reverb and space from it, because we're just going to actually add reverb to it. So this basically allows us to, select what kind of space we want to put it in, and that can all be done by just adding reverb onto it now. So listen to it with how it sounds now. So adding that reverb on there makes it sound a little bit more natural, and it gives us a little bit of control over the transients at the beginning. So let's actually listen to that in the mix and see what it sounds like. So I actually kind of like what that did. I'm just actually using this on this sound because I want to show you how the gate works. Again, I don't really use gates, but kind of what happened was we're getting the down beats, like the transients from this hit, and it's really accenting the beats in here, and that's kind of what I want the sound to do. I really don't care about the ring after it, so just having this reverb that makes it sound a little more natural, and it's also just putting it into the same space as the rest of the song. So yeah, I kind of like that. So let's just, before we move on to the next module, let's just go over real quickly the different parameters in here. So these are pretty typical for most gates. The ratio is how much actual reduction is going to be happening. So if you set it to like a 3-to-1, for every dB that goes over your threshold, which is this knob here, it's going to reduce it by 3 dBs. Same idea as like a compressor. So the range is the maximum amount of attenuation that you want to be applied to the signal when the gate is closed. So I kind of just have this set somewhere in the middle. The attack time is how quickly this reacts. So on a gate, you pretty much want to have it all the way to the left, because if you don't have it there, especially on something has a transient in it, like this drum hit here, it's not going to open in time to hear it. So that's why I have it all the way to the left. The release over here, I have pretty quick. So the release is important because this determines how fast the gate closes. It's like the fade out, basically, you could say. And there's an extra setting in here to even enhance that more, and that's the slope here. Now, from left to right is basically how smooth the slope would be, how smooth the fade out will be for that. And then the modes down here, you have between classic and vocal. So of course this is not a vocal track, so I went and set it to classic and that worked fine. And then you also have some sidechain filter options down here. So yeah, that's basically the Gate Classic. So let's move on to our next module, the Gate Drums. All right, so we got the Gate Drums here. And we're going to use this on the kick drum because I feel like maybe we can shorten up the, the ring of the kick drum a bit for this song. I think it would create maybe just a little bit more space because there's obviously a lot of stuff going on with this chorus. So I think it'll help a bit. Now let's actually go over here and read the description on it. The Gate Drums module is a transient-driven gate combined with a depleting process that cleans drum recordings. Now, to be honest with you, a drum gate is best used on toms. I think most engineers would agree with that. Yes, it will work great on a snare, work great on a kick, but toms, I think, more than anything. However, since there's no toms in this song, we will use it on the kick. So for the kick, I was playing around with this before I started this section of the tutorial, and I found out that I think the kick debleed smooth preset works really well. So let's actually listen to that. I'm going to start it disabled and I'll bring it in so you can kind of hear the difference. So let's put this in solo. Okay, so listening to that, you could see that it kind of shortened up the sustain of the kick, which, I think is good. My only fear is that we need to listen to the mix and see if it seemed to cut out a little bit too much of that beater sound. So let's hear in the mix and see what kind of adjustments we need to make. All right, so I really like how that sounds on this default preset here. Now, with it kind of making the sound a little less bright, a little less beatery, I did have to turn it up a bit. But when I got it up in the mix a little bit, it started to come through. And if you really notice, since it's kind of a shortened sound, you're really only getting that little, punch of each kick hit. And that makes it awesome. That's kind of what we want, because in this type of music and almost any type of music, you want a punchy kick. So this added quite a bit, and I actually like it. So maybe my opinion of gates are changing a bit, I guess you could say. This gate works almost exactly the same as the other one, except that the main thing about this gate is the transient detection. So this needs to be set because the idea is that this gate is only looking at transients, where the other gate's looking at amplitude/volume. That's the same thing. But when this is set properly, it's only going to get the actual hits you want it to get. So it was obviously getting my kick hits because it was set good in its initial position here, and it worked right for that. And the other section that's a little bit different is the debleed section, and this is how you can filter out the tail of the transient. I didn't enable this because I thought it sounded good as is, and it's also, staying with the preset here, it worked well. So, there's some more stuff you can play around with this gate here, but I think for this particular sound, I think we achieved what we were going for. So let's move on to our next module, which is the Hollywood. All right, so we got the Hollywood here, which is part of the Virtual Tube collection. Now there are 3 different modules within this collection, which we'll talk about in a row, But starting with Hollywood, let's read about this here. Fat, airy tube preamp and console-inspired boutique Hollywood studio tube circuits. Okay, so I really like to use this on sounds where I want to add a little bit of beefiness to them. So a snare drum, a kick drum, even bass guitar. So in our scenario here, we're actually just going to use it pretty subtly on the snare drum here because I think we already have a pretty good sound, but it could probably use just a smidge of saturation. So for the tube collection, I do like to use presets because there actually is not very many knobs on here. You got a mix knob, you got a high frequency, that's kind of like a bypass. It will not allow the low frequencies to trigger this to work. And you can set the actual frequency where that starts at here. You have your output, and this is how much saturation you're adding to it. So basically, the saturation knob is probably the most important knob on this module. You could choose whether it's a preamp or console. A console would be like if you were using it on a bus or the Mixbuss, you would set it to that. You have push and normal. So normal is what the original product they are trying to emulate sounds like, and push kind of takes that to the extreme. So for the snare drum, let's use this preset here called Snare Magic, and let's dial it in. All right, so I really like what that did. So we added some, just a little bit of saturation in. The mix knob is set at 20, so we're just kind of mixing it in with the original sound. And if you notice, it kind of brought out the sustain just a smidge. Now, the snare drum has reverb on it, but it brought the sustain, the original hit out. And since it's coming after the FG stress, it's bringing a little bit more of that crunchiness out via sustain. And I actually really like that. So the tube collections need to be used, I would say, subtly. For most instruments that you're going to be using them on. They could be used for effects, of course. You can add, use them as distortion effects using the saturation knob, but in this scenario, we just want to kind of blend it in. So let's move on to our next module, which is the London. All right, so we got the London module here. So let's read about this one. So it says warm, fat tube preamp and console inspired by British and European vintage tube circuits. So what I love about this module is that it really brings a nice subtly warm tube saturation to the sound. So I do love it on vocals, and I like it anything that I want to add warmthness to. So it sounds great on pads or synths. So for what we're going to test this with is this kind of underlying synth pad that I have. So let me solo it so you can hear it, what it sounds like, and I will turn this off. Okay, so this synth pad kind of lays underneath the other pad that we worked on earlier. It gives a little extra sizzle to it. So why don't we look at a preset in here for this? And if there's not a specific preset for the instrument you're working on, sometimes something simple like track color, or like a mix and max color if you're, mix and master color if you're using this on your master bus, or also a general track saturator. So let's start with a little bit of color first. We'll try this one out and we'll make some adjustments and see, what sounds better. Okay, so I really like that. It's pretty subtle, except I think this was quite a bit more obvious than when we were using the Hollywood one on the snare drum. So as you can kind of hear around the sides of this synth, it just kind of, I like to use the word inflated. You hear me use it a lot in these tutorials, but that's basically what it did. And it didn't really make it any louder. That's one thing I always look at when we put these plugins on to make sure that we have, an even volume level when we start and when we finish. So it added just a little bit of extra sizzle to it. And the pad that I soloed this with at the end is the pad I consider that this synth goes with. Together, they basically create one sound. And I really like the way they blend together with this, London module on it. So let's move on to the New York. All right, so we got the New York here. And it's my favorite of the Virtual Tube collection. And it's so much my favorite that we're actually going to use it in two places in this section. But let's first read about it here. So tight, aggressive, thick tube preamp and console inspired by American tube circuits. So this one tends to bring out the mids to upper mids. I hear the most when I apply this to tracks. And if you're trying to get a little bit more of that presence or bring something more forward, I think this sounds great on it. It sounds great on buses, sounds great on master mixes. It sounds great on vocals. It sounds great on everything. So what I'm actually going to use it for here is we're going to start to use it on the drum bus first. And then we're also going to use it as a parallel bass track. So let's start with the drum bus first. So let's play this here. And I am going to use the drum bus saturator preset. So just like the London, we use that very subtly in here. I did have the mix knob up pretty high. I had it at 80%, but our saturation is at 5, which is not even halfway. And again, you can feel the outsides of this drum bus kind of inflating, and very subtle, very nice. And a very, I would say, minimal adjustment to the kick and snare you can hear with this on, but in a very tasteful way. So yeah, I really like this on drum buses. So let's move over to the bass guitar here. So I've already created a complete copy of this track here. And what we're going to want to do is, let's slow it up here. Let me open up what we have over here. So this is what we were using when we were doing the FG-116 portion of this tutorial. So I'm going to leave this on here because we want to make an exact replica, including the signal chain, for this duplicate bass track here. And let's go down and insert the New York. And we're going to put on Bass To Be Magic. And let's solo and listen to this here. Okay, so I really like the way that sounds. So when I had that sold initially, and this initial preset didn't have quite enough saturation in there for me, I needed to get that kind of buzzing sizzle out of it. And the reason I like to get that sound out of it is that when we blend this in with the untainted bass track, we are getting it to be more present on like laptop speakers and less high performance speakers. It sticks out a bit more. So that's why we do parallel compression with bass, and that's why it's important. So this is definitely going to stand out a lot better on laptop speakers if you're listening on them. So so the New York is great for parallel compression. It's great on drum buses, and we mentioned it's great for vocals. So let's move on to our next module, which is the Revival. So this is the Revival module here. And I believe it's been around since the beginning of the Slate VMR, because I remember they even used to give it away for free. It was like the one module you can get for free and kind of test out this, plugin. So let's read about it over here. Revival is a sonic enhancement circuit based on years of analog modeling. It can be used to add air and thickness to individual tracks, but is also amazing on full mixes and masters for more depth, width, and low-end warmth and punch. So that's a perfect description of how I see this. And it does sound amazing on full mixes, I will say. And it often does end up in my Mixbuss chain. So that's a good place for it. Another good place for it is to put on a kick drum and just kind of boost up this thickness knob here. And it adds a nice little, boominess to the kick. So we're actually going to use it on the drum we messed with earlier that was kind of like the accent drum that hits on the downbeats in the chorus. I want to add a little bit more low end to that drum to give it more of a, I guess you could say, tribal feel. So let's solo it here and take a listen, and I'm going to dial in the thickness knob. So yeah, I think that sounds pretty good. I had to go pretty high on the thickness to get that low end I wanted out of it, because it's supposed to kind of accent with the bass. It does actually hit the same time the bass does. And when you saw I adjusted the shimmer like all the way up here, nothing, because the sound really doesn't have any really high frequencies in it. And I do think there is some further work that this sound needs, and maybe we'll make some adjustments to it later in this tutorial to get it where it needs to be. But I think for now that's pretty good. And so yeah, that's the Revival module. And let's move on to our next module, the Monster. All right, so we get the Monster here, which is an extreme dynamic processor. So it emulates the 1176 compressor, but with all the ratio buttons pushed in. That basically puts it into like super mode. So let's read about it over here. The Monster is an extreme dynamic processor capable of explosive and dramatic compression effects based on the all buttons mode of the famous FET vintage compressor. So I really never use this module, but if I had to, I would probably use it in some sort of parallel compression mode. And that's actually what we're going to do. So I threw it on the kick track here. And we're going to run a very low mix, so we're just going to kind of blend it in. So let's actually go to the presets here and go to Big Kick. And let's play this in solo first, and we'll try to dial it in, and then we'll bring it into the mix. All right, so I just brought that in very subtly, and as you heard probably in solo mode, it did bring out a little bit more of the beater sound, which we started to lose when we added in this, gate drums here. And we're probably going to add more of it back in before this tutorial's done. But for now, I think this does a pretty good job. Again, it's very subtle. It is highly compressed, but we're mixing it in at like 28%. So again, it's a parallel compression at this point. And I really don't use this module, so it's hard for me to say, hey, I love this thing or tell you a lot about it, but it's basically just a overdriven version of the 1176. So so let's move on to our next module, which is the trimmer. All right, so we got the trimmer module here, and you guys are probably going to laugh at me when I say this, but I actually really love this module. So let's read about it real fast. Trim level, phase reverse, RMS, and peak metering. And I bet you guys probably can't guess what I use this for. You're like, oh, volume. Well, true, but you know what I do? I do the Control Windows Alt, I hold that down on a computer, then I click on it, and I enable for automation. And what I like to use this for is the very last plugin on a plugin train per track. And I like to actually automate this volume control here as opposed to the faders, because as you guys know, when you automate faders, you lose control of them. So that's actually what I use this for. So I'm not going to play any music while I have this up because there's nothing you're going to hear different with this on it. But that's how I recommend using this plugin for automation. And if you ever need to like turn down, maybe your volume's too hot coming out of the VMR here, put it at the end of your chain, turn it down a bit before it hits the next plugin, and then you'll be in good shape. So let's move on to our next module, which is the U73B. All right, so we get the Audified U73B here, and this is a compressor / limiter, depending on how you set it. So let's read about it over here. The U73B is a faithful emulation of a vintage German broadcast compressor. So this plugin can be used on your master bus for some master bus compression. It can be used on individual tracks. It was popular between the 60s through the 80s, so it was used many years ago. And it's been known to have somewhat of its own kind of unique sound to it. It's a sound that I haven't really become accustomed to. Like I haven't really found a whole lot of use for it. But in messing around, I did throw it on this particular track here, and it actually did bring out kind of what I've been missing in it. So I actually put it on our big hit track again. That's the one that kind of hits on the downbeats in the chorus. So I'm going to play this in solo, and we'll enable this as we go so you can hear it. So you gotta admit, that actually did pretty nicely on that specific track. As I mentioned before, when we were adding in Revival, we added quite a bit of that low end in there, but I feel like we didn't have enough of that kind of like stick hit on it to give it that more tribal sound. And without even adding EQ, we got some of that brought out with this compressor here, and now it sounds a little more impactful when it hits. So I really like how that sounds on the specific track. So let's move on to our next module, which is the VCC channel. Okay, so I got the VCC channel module in here, and I use this module on all my tracks except for the Mixbuss or other buses, because there is a Mixbuss version of it here, which we'll talk about next. So what this does is it allows you to select what console you want your, your virtual mixing console to be. We don't have to, be stuck with this just being, what's inside of Pro Tools. We can color all the different tracks and make them cohesive by making them part of a console. And you can choose between these 6 different options here. So the Brit 4KE is an SSL console, so is the 4KG. The USA is an API console. The Brit N is a Neve console. This one doesn't tell you what it is, but it does have the icon of a trident, so I'm going to assume it's the trident console. And the RC tube console, it says in the manual, it's just a all-tube broadcast desk, so I'm not really sure what that one is. Honestly, I never use these two here anyway, so I would suggest you don't either, because these ones over here are absolutely amazing. So with that being said, let's actually right-click and read the description. Emulates the channel characteristics of each console. So what we want to do is I pop this on the arpeggio, since that's our most melodic instrument in this song here so far. I think we'll be able to tell how it gets colored the most using that sound. So let's start with the Brit 4KE, and I'm kind of go through these, and then I'll figure out which one I like. And then when I figure out which one I like, I need to apply this on every track. And then when we get to this Mixbuss version, we'll do the same with that, on the next part of this tutorial. So that being said, let's solo the arpeggio here. Let me hit play, and we're going to start with the Brit 4KE. All right, so the Brit N, which is the Neve console, is the winner for this. And I don't always do this by just picking a sound and then going through that and selecting a console, but for this tutorial, that's what I decided to do. So what I'm going to do is, and I'll do it in between this so you don't have to watch me do it, I'm going to add this to every track here. So then we have a pretty much full analog desk going on. And with that being said, in between now and our next VCC Mixbuss, I will have this added to all the tracks. So here we go. All right, so here we are in our last module in this tutorial, and it is the VCC Mixbuss. And in our prior section, we decided we were going to use a Neve console, so I've already set this to that. And I did apply the Neve channel portion of this module to all the tracks here, and then I have this one on the Mixbuss. So, essentially we have a full Neve console here. So let's give it a listen and see what it sounds like. All right, so that sounds absolutely amazing. I'm loving that, and I do have to admit that adding in the Neve console for the different channels and the mix bus really made this the sound of this mix come alive. It really has that analog warmth to it, and those harmonics and saturation, everything you can want from an analog console. And I really love what Slate did with these two modules here, and I know a lot of engineers that use them just the way I do on every track. So I think the last thing that I want to do in this tutorial is I want to do a playback with all the Slate modules off and all of them on, so you can kind of hear the difference. And in this playback here, I think we're probably using 90%, maybe even higher, of all the Slate modules in here. Obviously, there's a couple that we didn't keep in here, but they were not necessary for the session, and they were pretty minor things like the trim knob per se. So yeah, let's hear what it sounds like with them all off. All right, for you guys who actually made it this far, actually stuck around to the end of the video, you guys get a gold star for the day. This was a very long video, and the reason it was because there are so many modules within this plugin. And that's what makes it so great. As you saw through the tutorial, you got to hear a sample at the end of what it sounded like before I added the plugins and after. And it sounds amazing. It sounds 100 times better. Now, don't get me wrong, there is still quite a bit of mixing that needs to happen to that song to make it, be ready for radio. Of course, I still have a lot of recording to do for it too, but I just wanted to give you guys kind of an overview of what the plugins sound like and what they're used for. Because sometimes it gets confusing when we see all these different options that we have in plugins, and this tutorial's to make it easier for you. So I really hope you guys like this tutorial. Please give me a thumbs up so I can continue making this content for you. Subscribe, of course, and hit that notification bell to know I have new videos coming out. So I will see you guys later, and peace out.